Welcome to Our Curious Amalgam, the weekly podcast brought to you by the Antitrust Law section of the American Bar Association. Our Curious Amalgam explores the fascinating and increasingly overlapping world of competition, consumer protection, data protection, and privacy law. Each week, we bring you leading global experts on the most compelling issues of the day. Enjoy the show.
Hello, and welcome to Our Curious Amalgam. I'm Alicia Downey, and the title of today's episode is Competition in Canada in Decline? In this episode, we'll be discussing the Canadian Bureau of Competition's report, Competition in Canada from 2000 to 2020, An Economy at the Crossroads, Canada's first comprehensive analysis of competition across the Canadian economy during a critical decade. I'm here with my co-host, Barry Nigro. Barry, would you like to introduce our guest?
Thanks, Alicia. We are joined by one of the principal authors of the Competition in Canada report, Dr. Matthew Osborne. Dr. Osborne is Associate Professor of Marketing at the Department of Management at the University of Toronto, Mississauga, and University of Toronto's Rotman School of Management. Matt is also a Program Director at the Institute for Management of Innovation and the Marketing Area PhD Coordinator at the Rotman School of Management. Matt's research focuses on quantitative marketing, empirical industrial organization, behavioral economics, and machine learning, each one of which sounds like a full-time job. Matt, welcome to Our Curious Amalgam.
Hi, Barry. Thanks very much for having me here. It's great to be here. And you're right, all these things that I do, they feel like multiple jobs, more than 4 jobs at some times. One thing I should mention before I get started is a short disclaimer. So I should say the views and opinions I express in this podcast are entirely my own and do not represent any policies or positions of the Commissioner of Competition, the staff of the Competition Bureau, the Department of Justice, or the Public Prosecution Service of Canada.
Matt, for the benefit of those who've not yet had an opportunity to read the report, what were its key findings?
I would say overall, this report is a very macro level view of what's going on with competition in Canada. As Alicia mentioned, this was like our first report on this subject, and we basically just wanted to get an idea of what was going on. So what we did was we looked at a very broad array of indicators of competition. So things like measures of markups and profits, or concentration ratios, or measures of firm entry and exit. And what we found is that in the industries where competition seemed to be problematic, like in highly concentrated industries, for instance, indicators were getting worse, right? So like in concentrated industries, the industries were getting more and more concentrated. Less and less firms seem to be controlling the market, for example. One thing that I do want to mention is that one thing that's novel about this report is that we look at distributions of indicators across industries, right? So we split up industries by which industries are the most competitive and which ones are the least competitive. And we look at what happens across these different tranches. That's something that we think is important and that is novel, because if we look at just macro level averages, that might hide a lot of important things that are going on.
What prompted the Bureau of Competition to commission the report?
Yeah, the question about what's been going on with competition over the last 20 or 30 years is something that a lot of academics and a lot of government agencies have been really interested in recently. One thing I think that was especially important for the Bureau of Competition is that some of our sister agencies in different countries have been writing reports along these lines, right? So in the UK, the Competition and Markets Authority just had a report. The New Zealand Competition Authority had a report. And the Council of Economic Advisors in the UK, or in the US rather, they also wrote a report on competition along these lines. And there's also been a lot of academic work recently that's been looking at how indicators of competition have evolved in the EU and in the United States. One example is Ian DeLocker's work, which has been published and has been cited a lot. The issue is that we don't know a lot about what's going on in Canada. So there's one recent working paper by Bawani and Larkin that looks at publicly available data and looks at what's been happening with competition in Canada using publicly available data. And I would say that their findings are reasonably in line with ours. But what the Competition Bureau really wanted to do was take a very comprehensive look at what was going on in Canada using data that was reflective of all industries and all firms.
So the report discussed the need to modernize Canada's competition laws and adopt a whole-of-government approach. To those of us down here in the States, those are familiar words. As you may know, a centerpiece of President Biden's executive order on competition is a whole-of-government approach. When you were working on the report, was there any collaboration with the U.S.?
I'll give you two answers, actually. One is just focusing on this particular report. We didn't collaborate directly with the U.S. We did connect with the Competition and Markets Authority, or with the CMA in the U.K., and with the New Zealand Competition Commission when we worked on the report. A lot of what we did was modeled after the CMA report. We convened with them about the kind of data analysis they did and the kind of empirical work they did and some of the problems that they might have run into when doing that. I will mention very quickly, the Competition Bureau, of course, is aware of President Biden's executive order. So the Competition Commissioner actually mentioned this at a keynote at a competition summit earlier this year. And they actually had a keynote address by Professor Tim Wu at Columbia, who's at Columbia University, who was the architect of, or one of the architects at least, of Biden's new agenda on competition. So the Canadian and U.S. governments definitely do pay close attention to each other's laws. Just as some background, it's a sort of neat fact is that our antitrust law came in right around the same time that the Sherman Act did. I believe it was about a year earlier than that.
For those listening who would like to read the report, the webpage for this particular episode will include a link to the webpage of the Competition Bureau that has the report and some of the background information on it as well. So I commend you all to read it. But going back to the title of the episode, is competition in Canada in decline? Based on the report, how would you answer that question?
I think the report title suggests that competition may be in decline, and we're definitely seeing potential indicators of that in the industries that are least competitive. For people who are familiar with antitrust, right, this is perhaps not surprising. We might expect that in industries that are the least competitive, right, it's easiest for firms to merge and for a smaller number of firms to take control of an industry.
Which industries are highlighted as being like that in Canada?
Yeah, so this is something we actually didn't get into in the report. What we did was we took a very broad view, and we didn't break things out by sector, for instance. This is something that we're probably going to need to look at in like a future report. It's something we started thinking about, but we realized that we would need to do a lot more additional analysis to try to figure out what's going on and what indicators should be correlated with specific industries. One thing that we feel is that competition is complicated, and the way the competition works in different industries is very different, right? There's some industries that are maybe very innovative, where we might see competition happening through innovation, for example, right? And it may be the case that concentration in those industries is not always the best measure of competition, and we should look at something else like entry and exit rates. So it's a great question. I think one of the things that the Bureau sort of wants to get out of this report is it wants to spur further discussion, right? And it wants to spur further research. So I think looking at what sort of is going on industry by industry and what are the appropriate indicators to look at, that's, I think, one of the next steps that we should be getting into.
Do you think the report says anything then about the need for more or less rigorous antitrust enforcement in Canada?
Yeah, this is a great question, because if you've been reading the news on competition law in Canada, one of the things that you'll have seen is that the Canadian government has introduced a number of new bills which will potentially strengthen competition policy in Canada. And so I think our report comes at a good time to play into that discussion or inform that discussion. I would say overall, it does suggest that this is something we should be thinking about, and perhaps we should be moving in that direction. And we wouldn't be alone in this, right? Other countries around the world are, I think, thinking the same things. And other reports are finding similar findings to what we found.
So looking ahead, Matt, what do you think the Bureau of Competition will do with these findings? Has it announced any specific actions?
Yeah, so not yet. One thing to keep in mind about this report is this is really part of the Bureau's competition advocacy efforts. And this is actually new for the Competition Bureau, right? When we wrote this report, one of the things that we did that was new was we worked very closely with Statistics Canada and with data from Statistics Canada, which I believe the Competition Bureau had not done before. I think one of the things that we hope is that the work will be something that is paid attention to by legal scholars. But as I was saying before, I think the other thing that we're hoping is that this spurs more work. So there's really a lot more to be done, right? Like we're seeing potential indicators of competition getting worse in uncompetitive industries, but we don't really know why that is. And I think further work needs to be done to figure out why that is. And I think that's one thing that the Competition Bureau wants to work on, is they want to understand what's really going on industry by industry. Why are we seeing this, and where do we need to go from here? So this is really the first step. And then I think there's going to be more competition advocacy work, and hopefully work by academics as well. So I've worked on questions like measuring markups over time with Professor Nate Miller at Georgetown University, and Professor Gretchen Sileo, who's at Temple University, and Gloria Hsu, who's at the Federal Reserve in the United States, on measuring markups in the cement industry. And we're finding some similar patterns there where markups are going up over time. Detailed industry by industry studies, I think, are another thing that we should be doing, both as academics and government agencies.
You mentioned earlier the Council of Economic Advisors report that was published by the Obama administration. And that report concluded that a significant increase in industry concentration contributed to an overall decline in competition in the United States. Subsequent to its publication, the report was criticized for its use of certain census data, specifically that using ICS NAICS industry codes to analyze concentration did not reflect actual market structures. How does the methodology used in the report in Canada differ from the CEA report? Does it suffer from the same sort of potential criticism or not?
It's a somewhat complicated question, so I'll give maybe multiple answers to it. So thinking about the CEA report, so they looked at things, if I remember correctly, at what we call the two-digit NAICS level, okay, which would be like the sectoral level, which one could criticize for being too aggregate or being potentially very aggregate. Now, in our reports, we do a lot of our analysis using what the NAICS code level 2. We do it at the 4-digit NAICS code level, which is a little bit more disaggregate.
Matt, as you're explaining it, can you just describe in simple terms what a NAICS code is?
So a NAICS code is an industry classification code, and it's used to denote a particular industry. And so NAICS codes go from, I believe, like 1 digit to 6 digits. And the more digits that you have in a NAICS code, the finer is the aggregation. We have, I think, an example of how the aggregation gets more and more fine as you add more digits to a NAICS code. But for example, like I think there's a 2-digit NAICS code for finance and banking, right? And as you add digits to the NAICS code, you would start distinguishing between sort of different kinds of banking services, for instance, or financial services that could be provided to consumers. Hopefully that sort of gives you a better view of what NAICS codes are. Now, a problem with NAICS codes is that they don't correspond to what we think of as antitrust markets, right? So when we look at mergers, a NAICS code may be too narrow or it may be too broad, depending on the industry that we're looking at. Now, when we calculate stuff like competition, we're doing it at the 4-digit NAICS level, which is maybe is maybe a little bit narrower than what was done in the CEA report. But still, a 4-digit NAICS code may not correspond to an antitrust market for various reasons, right? So one example might be that we're not accounting for geographic competition. Competition between, say, coffee shops is probably very localized. So really what we would want to be doing is looking at very localized measures of competition. And there's recent research by Professor Esteban Rossi-Handberg, who's an economist, that finds that can really matter. You actually get different trends in concentration if you look at national averages versus regional measures of concentration. So I think going forward, this is something that the Competition Bureau would really like to see, is more work that tries to do a better job of measuring markets. Another thing I can say about our work relative to the CEA report is that we do look at what I would say is a broader range of indicators. And I think some of the indicators are maybe a little bit less susceptible to the concern about market definition. For instance, we look at things like markups or return on sales, right, which are going to be defined at the firm level. Concentration, I would be more worried about, because there we're going to be defining a market sort of at the industry level. So that could be another concern. That's another way that I would say we potentially address the issue you raised.
So you've had some time now to reflect on the report. What did you personally find most interesting about the report and the analysis that you performed?
Yeah, great question. I want to say all of it's pretty interesting to me. One of the things that sort of jumped out at me about the report was really the consistency of what we find with the indicators. Like, we looked at, I think, 10 to 12 different indicators, and across basically all of them but one, we find the same pattern, that the industries where competition seems to be lowest are the ones that are always getting worse. The only indicator where we found a difference here was something called the cost disadvantage ratio, which is designed to measure economies of scale. So there we actually found that was getting better over time across all different industries, or basically all different industries.
So if there's somebody without a degree in economics or even a background in antitrust asked you why this report is important and should they read it, how would you answer that?
There's a lot of things that I think are important about a report like this. One is its potential impact on competition law. And competition law is something that I feel affects all of us every day, because it affects the prices that we pay for goods and services, right? Anything that you go out and buy, almost anything is going to be produced by firms, right? And if firms have more market power, there's potentially concerns that they can raise prices and consumers can end up paying more. And I think it's important because we really just didn't know what was going on or what had been going on in the Canadian economy. I feel like if you ask people casually in Canada about competition, they'll say we don't have enough firms competing in different markets. But we never really had any numbers on that. Now we actually have some numbers on that, and we can say something about what's going on that I feel is more data driven. And I think, you see this in public response to government reports as well. So like earlier on this year, the Canadian government actually went through a consultation process where they solicited opinions from the public about competition law. And public interest groups, for instance, who responded to this, they gave the opinion that there's not enough competition in Canada. And I think having a report like this is very useful because it provides some information about whether those views make sense or not.
Before we let you go, Matt, Alicia and I have some questions to let our audience get to know you a little better. What piece of advice would you give young economists?
Yeah, so I would probably say a couple of things. One, I would say be curious and do the kind of work and the kind of research that you find interesting. I think for me, that's why I like doing economics, why I find economics interesting. And I like following up on research and questions that I think are fun. The other thing I would say is I think it's great. It's good practice to be open to unexpected opportunities. And I'll give an example of that from my own career path. So I had a somewhat unusual career path for an industrial organization economist. As you mentioned, Barry, I started out at the Department of Justice. I worked there for for a few years, and it was a very interesting job. I learned a lot from it, had great people to work with. But after a couple of years...
That's the U.S. Department of Justice, right?
Yeah, that's right. So this is all in the context of the United States, correct? Thanks for mentioning that. After a couple of years, I wanted to try something a little bit different, and I moved to the Bureau of Economic Analysis, which is in the Department of Commerce. And so if you know what the BEA, or the Bureau of Economic Analysis, does, they create the GDP numbers. So they're a more sort of macro-oriented shop. And it's not that agency maybe isn't a normal place for an IO economist or an industrial organization economist like me to move to, but it ended up being a really great experience. I got exposed to a lot of issues and problems that intersected with sort of macroeconomics and industrial organization that I might not have been exposed to elsewhere. Worked with a lot of really great people, and got to do a lot of really interesting research and got opened up to a lot of sort of new research questions that I never would have considered if I hadn't made a move like that. So that would be the other piece of advice that I would give.
Okay, I hope young economists out there are listening, because it all sounds like good advice, and good advice for anyone in any career. Keep an open mind and maybe go somewhere where there aren't a lot of people like you and have an interesting experience, and also work for really good people. That helps too. Matthew?
Exactly. I've had the pleasure. I've had the pleasure and the privilege of being able to do that.
Great. There's another question we like to ask all of our guests, and that is, now that we've heard about your very interesting professional accomplishments, tell us something interesting about yourself that is completely outside of your professional life.
Good question. Since I work like 4 different jobs, I'll have to think a little carefully about this. I'll say one thing I really like about living in Toronto is the live music scene. So I go to a lot of concerts here, a lot of live concerts, big ones and small ones. It's a great way to hang out with my friends and see new music that's fun. So I like that a lot.
What genre of music are we talking about?
Oh, all sorts of stuff. So I'm a child of the 80s. I go to a lot of rock and roll concerts, a lot of older bands that you probably remember I've seen and had a lot of fun at. But I enjoy other types of music too, hip hop music. Occasionally I'll go to punk or country music. Pretty much any concert I'm down to go to.
Thank you for supporting the arts in Toronto, Canada.
Oh yeah, we're happy to do it.
All right, you're not free yet. We're going to have to play the game that we play with all of our guests. We call it the Curious Hat.
And now it's time for the Curious Hat.
The rules of the game could not be any simpler. We're going to draw a completely random surprise question from a virtual hat. Take it away, Barry.
Thank you, Alicia. So I'm reaching into the virtual hat, and the question is, what is your favorite sport and why?
It might be hockey. He's from Canada.
This is a good question. So actually, I'm a terrible sports fan. With respect to sports, I don't really watch too many sports. I do enjoy going to live sports games. So like in the last year, I saw the Blue Jays play and I saw the Raptors play, and I really enjoyed it. When I lived in the US, I used to follow US football actually, but then I lost track of it when I moved to Canada. I'm a terrible hockey fan though, so I'm probably a terrible Canadian in that respect.
You're going to get tossed out of the country.
Yeah. Maybe I should edit that out.
That's very interesting. Yeah. Matt, thank you so much for being on our show. Alicia, thank you for hosting. And thank you to our listeners. Please tune in for the next episode of Our Curious Amalgam.
Thank you for listening to this week's episode of Our Curious Amalgam, a competition, consumer protection, data protection, and privacy law podcast. It is produced and shared around the globe by ABA's Antitrust Law Section. The opinions expressed by the participants in this podcast are their own and do not necessarily represent their employer or other organizations. If you like what you heard or would like to become a member of the American Bar Association, please check out what the Antitrust section has to offer at ambar.org/antitrust. You can learn more about our podcast at ourcuriousamalgam.com. If you have comments, suggestions, or podcast ideas, please reach out to us at podcast@ourcuriousamalgam.com. Until next time, thank you for listening.